Today, we're going to be talking about CSS frameworks, how to use them, but in particular, some specific ones, and also, the other side of CSS frameworks, what happens if you don't use one, and some, benefits and elements around that as well. So let's get started. So the I Am Tech Meetup is something that we run, and is sponsored by two particular vendors at the moment, which is Content by Kentico and MMT Digital. And a little bit about me. My name's Ilesh Mistry. I'm a CMS specialist and a content MVP. And I also run these I Am Tech Meetups, and you can subscribe to my YouTube channel using the QR code on the right-hand side. So a little bit about the tech meetups, and they're generally front-end driven topics. If you want to know more about future meetups, you can obviously subscribe to the channel or contact me. And also I'm available on LinkedIn, Twitter, and other social media platforms. If you're ever interested in talking at a future meetup as well, or know somebody else that would be good for it, please drop me a line and I can get in touch with them. So a quick thing about the sponsors. We've got Content by Kentico. They build digital experience without compromise, and it's basically a headless CMS that allows you to kind of use any technology you want with them. And on the right-hand side, you've got a few areas that you can do a 90 days free trial if you wanted to use that. And also they've got a Discord area for all the developers in the community around. And they are also recruiting. So there are a few sort of roles out there that you could be interested in. Use the QR code on the right-hand side to follow them up. Another thing about one of our sponsors is MMT Digital. They're part of an MSQ company and digital consultancy and trusted delivery partner using technology to build a better future. The key sort of areas for them is design and build, accessibility, sustainability, and composable products. So if you need to contact them, QR code's on the right-hand side. And they are also recruiting, like everyone else. There's lots of roles here at MMT Digital. So, whether you're into front end, back end, server side, you can basically check out their QR code and check out some of the opportunities out there. So before we get started, just make sure you're on mute and ask your questions in the chat, and we can try and pick them up at the end of each of the sessions. So there'll be like a Q&A after each session. We are recording, so just bear that in mind. And it'd be great if you guys can share on social media with some of the handles there, but also I'm sure each of the people that are going to be talking will be sharing their platforms as well. And one of the good things that you could do today is win some I Am Tech Meetup swag. So if you are interested in winning some swag, we'll have a sort of a lucky prize draw at the end, and you can enter your details with the QR code on the right-hand side, and I'll be sharing that link again during some of the sessions as well. So today we've got a great sort of set of speakers here. So myself, I'm going to be talking about a quick intro into Tailwind CSS. Then we'll have Swapnil on CSS frameworks and normal CSS. Brandyn then going to be talking about introduction to Bootstrap, which will be good as well to help to kind of show the different frameworks out there. Then we've got Joe from Foundation CSS talking about Foundation CSS. And then we'll have Luke later on talking about Tailwind at runtime. So let me just switch screens. request this not to work right now. Here we go. Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen there. And I just start this off. Okay, so hi everyone. This is the IM Tech Meetup and my presentation regarding an intro to Tailwind CSS. A big disclaimer here is the fact that I'm not an expert in Tailwind CSS, but I'll basically show some of the things that I've learned so far and some of the things that I'll be sort of showing as well. If people haven't joined a little bit later, basically my name is Ilesh Mistry. I'm a CMS specialist and a content MVP. You can get to my content details on the right-hand side using the QR code. So what I'll be sort of covering is what is Tailwind CSS, why you could use it or why you should use it. There'll be also a quick demonstration of how to configure it and then show a few elements of why I think it's really good. And then I'll provide a few takeaways that would be something that you can take away from the session. So, Tailwind CSS, something that I basically got onto or really started to learn was from a project quite recently that I was put on. I'd probably never used it before, but I found that it was very sort of easy to pick up and learn. So what is it? So it's a utility first CSS framework, allowing you to kind of quickly build user interfaces. It has like elements already there for you to kind of pick up and roll, and predefined utility classes that you can use for common CSS styling. So, if you imagine you're styling a button or a React component, when you have some kind of classes like this that are already there, it really is super handy. There's a quote from the creator of Tailwind, Adam, there as well, like, best practices to actually work. He's obviously, explaining the difference between going for a traditional CSS approach compared to Tailwind and other frameworks out there, because when you work on large projects, it can be quite hard to kind of manage that when it comes to big projects out there. So why use it? So as it is, it's a utility first. You don't have to worry about the common issues that you would have CSS classes, and especially when you change on projects. One thing I like about it is the fact that it scans through all of the areas that you recognize or want to actually pick out the CSS for. So HTML, you can basically configure a file, a config file, to allow you to pick out what areas that you want to be using and what Tailwind should be kind of adding to it. It has small bundle sizes, as it only ships what you're using, which I've found in the past when I've worked on other projects where there's unwanted CSS, unwanted things on there, where actually what you want to kind of be doing is just making sure that you ship what's going to be used. I found so far it works well on both small and large projects, and it's easy to use, and it has great documentation. And it's easy to extend as well with the Tailwind config file. The other couple of reasons is that it uses the latest CSS features like CSS grid, transform, and it also has dark mode, which is always something that all developers love. One thing that I find that was really good with this is the fact that it's got a VS Code IntelliSense extension, which is awesome, which works really well with when you're actually developing any Tailwind websites. And if you're used to CSS preprocessors like Sass and Less, you can obviously use those in here as well. And I found, especially when I was working on this on a project, is that one of the biggest things for me is the fact that there was convenience of having these set of classes and class names there available for me to use, especially when we have to kind of deliver projects quite fast. So before I go into the configuration, I'm going to just quickly come off that screen. And hopefully you can still see my screen on there. And just show you on the right-hand side, this is basically I've just taken a template from somewhere to kind of see that there's nothing on there, nothing styled on there. What I'm going to do is just quickly talk you through the installation process. So, most of this stuff is on the documentation, but what you need to do is use the Tailwind CLI. So I'm just going to install that and initialize Tailwind. And I'll be sharing what's there anyways, but you can see here that at the moment is what it's done is it's created the config file for Tailwind. And within here, you can do lots of stuff like extending Tailwind, but the key thing here is as well is that you probably just need to tell it where are your files that Tailwind should kind of look at. And basically, I'm going to have an input area, input CSS area, and I'm going to, at the moment, just say, look at the HTML file as well. So all I've done is I've updated the Tailwind config with sort of like a path reference to what I'm going to be using. One thing that Tailwind does have or need is that it's got some utility or directive classes that we need to use. So I'm just going to bring those across as well and add those in. And once that's there, then you're ready to kind of roll really with lots of stuff that you're working on. Like the key thing is obviously you've got to make sure that you're going to use an output CSS file, which I haven't created yet. But when I do this, I'm going to add like a watch command to kind of my terminal here. And what this will do is obviously it'll create my output file with the elements within Tailwind that are required for this page. So on the right-hand side, hopefully demo gods are with me. So if I hit refresh, you can see that that's now actually picked up everything I wanted to do from my HTML file that has Tailwind elements within it. And I just want to quickly show that it's very easy to install and get going. The other aspect of it is the fact that the Visual Studio extension that I was talking about earlier, if I go and look at here and say I wanted to change the background color of a particular page, the configuration or the IntelliSense here is really, really awesome that you can see all the different options available for you. Again, got to bear in mind that all of these options are not going to be put into your output file, but let's go for sort of like a dark red and just save that. And I haven't got sort of like auto reloading, but I'm just going to hit refresh on this side. You can see that's come across there. So you can see like, if that was a separate class, then you would probably have to kind of, rebuild that class with the elements in there. But I feel like this case that, you don't need to have all of this listed in CSS files. You can probably just go ahead and just add what you need, and then that becomes in your particular output file. So if I go into the output file itself and search for red there, you can see that that's there and available for us to use. So I'm going to quickly go through and have a look at a few more examples of saying let's add in some extra margin at the top or between these cards. So you can just see here that Visual Studio gives you a good indication of what each of these classes are going to be doing. So here I could probably just change that to another value. So let's just say I want to do a padding top of 14 rem or 3.5 rem, sorry, and save that and bring that across in there. And that obviously allows it to see that quite quickly and make those adjustments. I feel it's sort of very convenient, especially when you're working on things like components that are in a library that may not have a front-facing website straight away, because what you can then do is build that up within sort of like React components and allow you to kind of see this when you actually are working away. The other thing I wanted to quickly show was the awesome Tailwind documentation. And within here, I found this was super useful. So I was like working on a project and I was like thinking, okay, maybe like, I wanted to adjust, what is the syntax for adjusting the color or the border? So, one of the things you can look at in here is just do a search for a specific CSS element. And let's say I wanted to change, the border radius of something. You've got various examples within here that you can use. And you can obviously utilize the ones that are most appropriate for you as well. And I think this documentation is awesome. It allows you to kind of very easy to use, and you can do a lot of elements of normally what you would expect with the normal CSS side of things in a such a sort of like easier way. I feel it's very convenient as well. So I'm going to flick back to my presentation. So part of that presentation was really going through the configuration aspect of it, and you can obviously check this out later. And I went through the watch command as well. So that's kind of it for me. I wanted to do a quick intro on Tailwind and just kind of explain some of the aspects around it. For me, one of the big things was that, once you start using it, I feel you probably want to, not go back to traditional CSS. The key advantage for me was, the fact that it's smaller bundle sizes and it allows you to only really, ship what you should be shipping in terms of CSS. I've mentioned this a few times, but I found it was super convenient to use this and allows us to do speedy delivery, especially when we're working with React components and component libraries that serve, multiple websites. The good thing about the VS Code IntelliSense is that, if you are sort of beginning to learn about Tailwind, that's a handy tool that you can use. We've already seen the awesome documentation, and I felt that was very easy to get going, which I showed earlier, and start using Tailwind. So that's kind of it from me. Very quick presentation on the intro to Tailwind. You can see my contact details on the right-hand side. And if you want to subscribe to the IN Tech Meetup, there's a QR code as well. So I am going to see if there's any questions. If not, we can go to the next session. And if anyone's got any questions right now, they can just pop them on as well. So
can I ask a question?
Sure, yeah.
I mean, just want to make it like more interactive, otherwise. So I think Tailwind, I know they say utility class, but I think the reason actually Tailwind, at least like selling point is, if Amazon and Netflix both uses the Bootstrap, so end of the day they look similar. So I think that's what they're trying to say. Like, if you use Tailwind, if you want your own like that CSS styling, like a different, unique product, whatever. So that's where the so it's utility class. It's obviously different. I think that's what I believe. Like when I was using, that's one. And second, also it seems, let's say, we use a lot of CSS, right? Like if you're using Bootstrap, so you end up like running out of the class names. I mean, you don't, but I'm just saying that's what they were saying. You have like huge number of CSS file, like 500 lines. I mean, I've seen really in 300 400 like CSS class files. That's what they're saying. So to avoid that, you just use inline Tailwind, with very minified kind of way of achieving the same. I think that's also like another selling point. But I think I want to see the flip side also, like more than the selling point. Okay, yeah, of course. Sorry, go ahead, please.
No, I agree with you. No, carry on. Sorry. Yeah.
And I was saying this, the flip side, since having used, right, since I've used, I think we're not negative or positive, but it's like, if you're using, let's say 32 pixels or 31 pixels, you can have only multiples of 4. So then the way I've done is, let's say you want to have a width of, let's say 98 pixels, then you can only like divide by 4 and it'll give you whatever, let's say 20 or 24 or 16. So it's a set of multiple of 4. So you have to do some kind of adjusting that pixels, like round up or like a round down. That's kind of one adjustment you have to make. And second, I think you rely more on the documentation. I had like, even now, as you were explaining to me, I had to learn the documentation, like Bootstrap or like over the time you'll know some of the class names, right? Like, but I think Tailwind, maybe you'll get it if you use like all along, but you have to use the documentation because nobody will remember, like, those, especially is it MT or MX, or T or Flex, I mean, good or bad, I'm just saying, that's my experience of using Tailwind. I just want to share my thoughts on that. Thanks.
No, thanks for sharing. And I agree with you with sometimes it's a case of if I was building just one standalone website and the designer came to me and said, rather than using, say, 4 pixels, you need to use, 3 pixels or something. And they want it pixel perfect. And I agree with you, like, sometimes there's scenarios where that is kind of lacking. Where this works really well is when you're building component-based elements. So when you actually are building a card component or a button component where pixels are great, but what it means is that you're making sure that you're ensuring all of your components are pretty much styled very similarly or using similar concepts. And I think that's a bit that I totally agree with what you're saying in terms of pixel perfect. And what we would probably do on our side is probably just make sure we speak to the designers in UX and say, okay, this is what we're using. For example, Tailwind. We are sort of like not restricted, but we have to kind of follow what's there. You can still overwrite, obviously. You can use a Tailwind config to overwrite it to how you want it to be. But obviously, if we've got this already out the box, it's better to sometimes just kind of use what's there if we can, unless we have to kind of deviate where there's strict guidelines we have to follow. But totally agree with what you're saying as well. Awesome. If there are no more questions, what I will do is, just get my screen. So I'm going to now hand over to Swapnil. Just let me know when you're ready and I'll stop sharing my screen as well.
Sure, Ilesh, I am ready actually.
Okay, great. Over to you.
Okay, thanks for having me. Let me share my screen. So, yeah. Yeah, can you see it?
Yep, I can, yeah.
And I'm audible, right? Correctly?
Yep.
So, just a minute. So, first of all, thank you, Ilesh, for having me, and thank you guys for joining in. So today we will be speaking about vanilla CSS and CSS frameworks. So we will be answering all the questions, like we will be comparing vanilla CSS, CSS frameworks, then also answer questions like what you should learn first. Should you learn vanilla CSS or should you learn directly jump onto CSS frameworks like Tailwind CSS or Bootstrap? And which one is better? Like if you should even study CSS frameworks or not? Or should you just should you just study Tailwind CSS and do not study vanilla CSS? So is that okay? So we'll be answering all that questions today. So let's move to the next slide. So my name is Swapnil Mane. I am a front-end web developer and data extraction expert. I am also a freelancer on Upwork, and I am also a content creator on Twitter. So if you are interested in content like web development, freelancing, and programming related tweets, then you can follow me there. And if you have any questions like during your programming journey, you can DM me there, and I will answer you as soon as possible. So yeah. So first of all, let's compare vanilla CSS and CSS frameworks. I am sure that most of you must be knowing this already, but let's do this as fast as possible. So vanilla CSS, first of all, we use vanilla CSS or pure plain CSS. We use it to style any web page which is built with HTML, and it's the starting point to style the web pages, and it includes the normal plain CSS that we use, and which also includes Flexbox and CSS Grid, which are great to speed up your styling process. And I definitely recommend you to learn Flexbox and CSS Grid along with vanilla CSS. And then we have different frameworks. So frameworks are actually built on vanilla CSS itself. So behind the scenes, they use vanilla pure CSS, and they are made to make your styling process even faster than vanilla CSS. So that's why they are made. So some people observe that yeah, vanilla CSS is great to style the pages, but yeah, it's a little slow process. So that's why they developed different frameworks to make that styling process faster. And that's how we came across different frameworks, and I have listed some of them down below, which are one of the most popular CSS frameworks. So like Tailwind CSS, then we have Bootstrap, then we have Foundation, then we have Bulma, then we have Skeleton, and a lot more. So we'll be discussing all of this in the next slides. So use of CSS, of course, we will finish this, but this is just an intro video. So HTML page without styling will look like this, and on the right side, if you see, after styling CSS, after using CSS, this will look something like this. So that's the main use of CSS, and that's why CSS is so important to improve the user experience and to improve the website conversion also. And what are CSS frameworks? So CSS frameworks, as I said, they are made to make your styling process a lot faster, and they are built on plain pure CSS itself. And also different frameworks have different style of working. Like if we see Bootstrap, they use component based approach for styling. So in Bootstrap, you have lots of components that you can directly copy and paste the code and put it on your website, and they will be shown on your website. While like Tailwind CSS, they are utility based. They provide you with utility based classes that you can use in your code, and that will make your CSS styling process faster. So speaking more about Bootstrap, so it is a framework. So as you can see on the left side, we have a component. So if you have to, so like this, they have a lot of different components. Like they will provide you nav bars, then cards, then progress bars and alerts. So similar to this, a lot of different components. And you have the code. They will provide you with the code that you can directly copy and paste in your HTML code after linking Bootstrap with your HTML code, and this will be shown on your website. So that's how Bootstrap works. So they provide you with different components. Yeah, so this is how Bootstrap works. So I will actually say, uh, I won't actually recommend you to use Bootstrap. There are special cases where you can use Bootstrap. Like if you are a backend developer and you are not mostly focused on front end part, like you want to build the front end part as soon as possible, or if you have a deadline, then Bootstrap is definitely very powerful to build front end as fast as possible. Like you can build your front end in 2 to 3 days, even like your front end part of the website. And that's when Bootstrap is definitely very helpful. But in most of the cases, I won't actually recommend you to learn Bootstrap, because I have seen that a lot of Bootstrap websites look very similar. So that is one of the downside of Bootstrap. And you can do a lot of customizations in this, but instead of doing customizations, I will recommend you to directly just use plain pure CSS itself, because customizations can get a little tough in Bootstrap. And instead of taking that much effort, you can use vanilla CSS, which is definitely great to do anything you want. Like to create any design you want, it is completely enough. And that's why I will say that Bootstrap is like, it depends on your like it depends on what you like what are your conditions. Like if you are a backend developer, then you can use it to build up the front end as fast as possible. So that's about Bootstrap. Then about Tailwind CSS. So Tailwind CSS is definitely great. It has gained a huge popularity in recent days. If you go on Twitter, I hear it a lot. Like people are very liking Tailwind CSS. It's mostly because it solves the problem that Bootstrap had. So they give you a huge set of utility classes that you can use to design the web pages. And so Bootstrap had the problem that most of the most of the websites that were made with Bootstrap look a lot similar. And with Tailwind CSS, actually, if you see a website which is made with Tailwind CSS, then a user won't be able to identify if it is made with Tailwind CSS or is it made with normal vanilla CSS itself. So that is which makes it very Tailwind CSS a very popular framework. And yeah, so you can create your own custom designs, and it provides you a lot of freedom to design your own web pages. And yeah, So that's one of the thing I like a lot about Tailwind CSS. So we will compare Tailwind CSS with normal plain CSS. So if you have this component on the top chit chat component, and for if you have to write this, if you have to design this component in HTML and CSS, so for that you will have to write this much code in plain vanilla CSS, this much HTML code and this CSS code. So here, as you can see, we create our own classes, chat notifications and those, and then we use those classes to like we write CSS properties to design this component, like display flex, then padding 1.5 rem. These are all vanilla CSS properties that you can use to design this component. Now, if we see the same thing in Tailwind CSS, this much is the code that you have to write, like just this much. And yeah, there is a huge difference, and this is what makes Tailwind CSS so popular. And that's why people are liking this so much. And people actually prefer to use this instead of directly, like they directly like to jump on Tailwind CSS even, and uh, like ignore vanilla CSS, which I think is not actually correct, but we will be discussing this in next slides. So this is why Tailwind CSS is so popular. It like directly boosts your speed by 2x or 3x. So yeah, but actually Tailwind CSS also has some negatives. So we will discuss this now. But before going to that, so the difference between Bootstrap is like they provided you with components, but here as you can see that in the classes section, they are providing you with classes that you can use to design this component. So here back for normal vanilla CSS, we designed our own classes, but here in Tailwind CSS, they will provide you with classes and you will have to use those classes to design this. And actually behind the scenes, they are using vanilla CSS itself. So if you see this flex class, so behind the scenes they are using this display flex property itself, but uh, and they have actually written out the complete code for you and you just have to use those classes. So that's the thing which makes it so fast. So yeah, so we have discussed the advantages of Tailwind CSS and it's actually great framework, but we also need to discuss about the negatives of Tailwind CSS. So to later make a decision that if you should learn Tailwind CSS or not. So one of the negative of Tailwind CSS is that you have to, if you are not using a framework, like if you are not using a React or Angular framework, then you will see yourself that you are copying and pasting a lot of classes, lot many times in your code. Like while designing a web page, then you will see that you are copy pasting the same classes for different elements, and that may be a little hectic sometime. So that's one of the negatives. And the second thing is you will have to memorize the Tailwind CSS classes. So first of all, if you are learning vanilla CSS, then you have to memorize the vanilla CSS properties. But then after you jump to Tailwind CSS, you have to also memorize the Tailwind CSS classes also. Uh, like they are mostly similar to vanilla CSS properties, but still you will have to memorize. You don't have to memorize all the classes because you can refer to the docs as well. But you will have to memorize the most of the classes that are usually used in your code. So that's one of the negatives. And at last, I will say that one of the negative, this doesn't like, it's not a big negative, but yeah, at last Tailwind CSS is a framework. So before Tailwind CSS, Bootstrap was very famous. It is still very famous, but after Tailwind CSS came, a lot many people are jumping to Tailwind CSS. And so similar to this, what if a better CSS frameworks comes within some years? So after that, like it is still better for the present time, but after 3 to 4 years, if you jump to another framework, then you will have to do the same thing again. You will have to understand how it works, and you will have to like you will since you memorized all the Tailwind CSS classes, that may go to when. So that's one of the negatives. But yeah, still it's I will say Tailwind CSS is still great because it's speeding up our present work of styling the web pages. So that's one of the point for Tailwind CSS. So what is my take on if you should learn Tailwind CSS or not? So let's see. So what I will say is it actually depends. So if you are a front-end web developer and you will be completely focused in the front-end side for upcoming years, like 6 to 7 years at least, then I will definitely recommend you to learn Tailwind CSS, because you will be seeing this a lot often. A lot of developers are using Tailwind CSS, so you may see this being used in teams, and that's why Tailwind CSS, if you are a front-end developer, it becomes important to at least understand how it works. Don't deep dive into it, but you can at least understand how it works so that you don't have any difficulty working with teams. And but yeah, before learning Tailwind CSS, make sure that you are great at vanilla CSS itself, because lot many properties of Tailwind CSS, like a lot of classes that they provide, are very similar to the properties of vanilla CSS. And so it's important for you to at least uh, be good at vanilla CSS. So what you can do is actually create 7 to 8 projects and then jump to Tailwind CSS if you are planning to learn Tailwind CSS. And I think if you don't understand vanilla CSS and you are directly jumping to Tailwind CSS, then you won't be able to actually create that great designs using just Tailwind CSS, because vanilla CSS is, I think, important for Tailwind CSS. For Bootstrap, you can directly use Bootstrap without uh, being master at vanilla CSS. But for Tailwind CSS, at least I will say that you should know plain pure CSS. And actually, before going to the next slide, I also want to say, if you are a backend developer or if you are a full stack web developer, then I think it's okay if you skip Tailwind CSS or any other CSS frameworks, because you are already learning a lot of different things if you are a full stack web developer, and you have to learn like front JavaScript frameworks like React, Angular. Then you have to learn backend technologies. Then I think it's okay if you skip this, because you will have to invest more time in learning this and practicing this. And uh, and you can actually build anything you want with just vanilla CSS itself. It's actually very powerful, and you can make the process of vanilla CSS even faster, which we will be discussing next. But yeah, so you can, in that case, you can skip Tailwind CSS or any other CSS framework, since you will have to learn a lot of different things at the same time. So yeah. So, so if you decide to skip Tailwind CSS and just focus on vanilla CSS itself, which is definitely great. So in that case, I will say that make sure you learn these technologies, which are Flexbox, CSS Grid, and Sass. Sass is a syntactically awesome style sheets. It is a CSS preprocessor, which will make your CSS life a lot a lot easier and a lot faster. So I will definitely recommend you to learn this, because they have like great features like mixins. Then they have CSS variables and the uh, code that they use, and like you can combine this with BEM methodology, which makes this even more faster. So these are some of the features of Sass. So I will definitely recommend you to learn this. And you can for practicing your CSS skills, these are some of the websites like Frontend Mentor. It is a great website to practice your CSS skills, and like they provide you with real Figma based and Photoshop based designs, and you have to code the entire website with HTML CSS by looking at the designs. And then you have CSS Battle and CodePen, which are also awesome websites. Then I will end this presentation with one point, a summary note, that learn a CSS framework, but not at the cost of ignoring vanilla CSS. Because at last, vanilla CSS is the basics, which will like which you can use to build anything you want, and it is here to stay for a lot longer time, lot longer than frameworks too. And yeah, this is what's more important. You can learn CSS framework, but don't ignore vanilla CSS. So thank you, and let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you. I think there's one question in the chat. I can ask it here. So which one is preferred, Sass or Sass with the CSS?
Which one is preferred between Sass and SCSS?
Yeah.
I personally use SCSS. Like with Sass, you can omit some of the characters. I don't think like it's difficult to get started with. So I personally prefer SCSS, but it actually depends on user to user. Both are actually almost the same, so you can try both of them out and see which one works for you.
I think one of them is simpler to use or install, right? One of them is complex. That's why people tend to use the SASE versus the less processor. No?
No, I think it's almost like not very different. Both the processes are almost similar.
So Sean's putting there CSS is valid SAS, so you can paste that CSS in the SAS file.
Yeah, the last question, right? Which do you prefer, CSS Grid versus Flex?
Yep.
So, yeah, actually I prefer both of them because both Flexbox and CSS grids are definitely helpful in different type of situation. Like CSS grid is helpful in building 2D dimensional projects. Like it has some features which are a little different. They are almost similar, but I usually use both of them and find both of them great. So you can learn both of them.
Actually, if I can jump in, add to the same the answer. So like I think he mentioned, right? So grid is for like 2-dimensional, but the way I would look at is let's say if you're laying out, right? If you're laying out in one direction, like top to bottom or left to right, then people prefer to use the flex box, and it was there for longest time. So people are more familiar and whatnot, more knowledgeable. Whereas grid is like if you're laying out, like you want to do in 2 direction, like left to right and top to bottom. In that case, people like use a grid. And it's less, actually, I've not used grid a lot, but Flexbox is more widely used. So in that sense, the grid is, I think, people are getting, I think, a little bit difficulty to the grid.
Yeah, right. Actually, with Flexbox, if you have like different blocks in the same page, and when you try to decrease the you try to make it responsive for different sizes, then the blocks get like properly aligned. So that's one of the use of CSS grid, which is a little different than Flexbox, and it may be better in some cases.
Okay, there's one more question on there. If someone is going to learn CSS, what areas would you recommend from your perspective?
So, first of all, I will say that focus on basics. Like don't jump on Flexbox and CSS grid until you understand basics, like you have float and a lot of those things which you can use before using Flexbox, and build up projects with that, and then jump to Flexbox and grid. Like there are great Udemy courses also, like Jonas has some of the great Udemy courses for CSS. He has one basic CSS course and he has one advanced CSS course, so you can look into that, and that's what I will prefer. Then you also, I will say that you can practice your CSS skills on Frontend Mentor. It's a great website.
I think there's one more question. Sorry, who is the author for CSS? Don't know the answer to that one.
So I was asking, I think you were saying some author on the Udemy, right? I was asking who is the author name for CSS. Some good resources you were saying. Can you repeat that again?
Yeah, CSS Tricks is also a great website. Like they have a lot of great articles on like every topic, so you can also refer to that.
Okay, great. I don't think there's any more questions. Thank you, Swapnil.
Thank you, Ilesh. It was great.
Thank you. So, Brandon, are you ready for yours?
Yeah, I'm ready to go.
Awesome. Swapnil, I think you might need to start sharing.
Right, can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, great. And hear me well? I sound fine?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So, hey everyone, my name is Brandon. Right now, I'm actually a freelance web developer. I'm relatively new to web development, a few months in. For my day job, I'm actually a commercial real estate analyst, but I do believe that the web development skills are very good to have. And right now, really focusing on learning and getting good with JavaScript and React. So, right now for my presentation, I'll be going over the Bootstrap framework, really an introduction. I don't have slides prepared, but I will be doing a website demonstration. So good to start with what is Bootstrap? Presenter had gone over this before, but it's an open source front-end development framework, collection of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript tools for creating and developing building web pages and web applications. It was developed with responsive design in mind. So using this framework, websites will render pretty well in a variety of window or screen sizes. And it was actually created by two employees at Twitter, Mark Otto and Jacob Thornton, at Twitter for Twitter. And right now, the most current version of Bootstrap is going to be Bootstrap 5. So some reasons to learn and potentially use Bootstrap. Personally, I was introduced to Bootstrap through a bootcamp that I am currently finishing up. Immediately saw how it was able to cut down on development times, and I spent a lot less time struggling in CSS. And I've read that web developers, web designers like Bootstrap because of its flexibility, and it's pretty easy to work with as well. Some of the main advantages, I would say, responsive by design, maintains a pretty wide or pretty broad browser compatibility. A lot of the components are reusable, easy to learn, quick to learn, and for developers, you don't have to worry about design as much, especially if you're really trying to get a website up in a relatively short amount of time. This could be a pretty good framework to use. With what's included, comes bundled with some basic HTML, CSS design templates, typography, tables, forms, buttons, drop-downs, nav bars, progress bars, accordions, carousels, and much more. And many of the components actually use JavaScript extensions and jQuery plugins. It also employs a mobile-first design philosophy. So that contributes to the responsive design. A single code base is going to work well with phones, tablets, desktops. Bootstrap really uses a fluid grid system to achieve its responsiveness. It can be applied to appropriately scale up to 12 columns. And the grid system has 4 tiers of classes. Extra small is going to be for phones, small is going to be for tablets, medium for desktops, and large is going to be for larger desktops. You're also able to use Bootstrap themes, which are essentially website templates created with Bootstrap in mind, reusable packages containing CSS, HTML, JavaScript code used for styling, various user interface components and page layouts that can be used to create a website pretty easily and quickly. And you can actually get these from the Bootstrap website as well. So I'm going to get into the website demonstration portion. All of the code I'll be using is actually from the docs portion of the Bootstrap website. And for this demonstration, I'll just be using it, yes, thinking, you're not using a JavaScript library. We'll just be importing the CSS and the JavaScript in the HTML file directly. So you'll want an HTML file, obviously. You'll want to import the CSS. You can get this from the Bootstrap website. up here in the head portion, and then the JavaScript, right before the closing body tag. And once you have those imported into the HTML, you're good to go. So right now I'm going to create the world's ugliest website, but this is really just to show you how quickly and how easily you're able to get up and going with this. So again, all this code, essentially you're able to copy and paste from the docs section, and I'll be starting with navigation bar. If you're right here, pretty basic, you're able to pretty easily, pretty quickly customize it to whichever use case. Let's get a carousel in here where you're able to display a few pictures. It's usually on the home page. If you're using it for maybe a client that wants to display a few different products, you can pretty quickly and pretty easily get this up and running. And I've used a few cat pictures just for example. And again, it's pretty easy to go in. Let me see. There's a few source attributes, able to just go in, copy and paste whatever you want. All right, what else do we want to do? Let's get an accordion component in here. All right, we're going to do a little accordion component. This will employ some of the JavaScript. And let's say, for instance, client wants, an image or product card. This again, code straight from the docs section. Then you're able to create several cards just by copying and pasting. And because it uses that grid system, it's going to be pretty easy to format all of that. I believe another presenter mentioned before, but sometimes using custom CSS with Bootstrap can get a little tricky. So I'll actually show how you can change some of the colors. So right now the background is like a light gray. Change that to like a light blue, and it actually also changes the color for the text as well. So, if your text is white and you're changing it to a white background, it'll change the text to black. So that's a lot less to worry about as well. And that blue is a little obnoxious, so let me change it back to the light.
Categories.
Let's see. Pretty common component to be using maybe a form. You can have site users enter in email and password. Let's get this copied and pasted in. Pretty quick, pretty simple, and pretty easy. A lot less time to worry about getting the front end up. And I was able to create pretty simple, not the best design, but it is a front end that you are able to customize pretty quickly and pretty easily. So I would say the docs are going to be your best friend here, and it outlines, the components that you would want to use over here on the left-hand side. So I actually pulled the form for this, directly from the website, copy and paste. So instead of having to struggle with the CSS and JavaScript, especially if you're just starting with web development, this could be a pretty good resource to use. Let's see. So yeah, I mean, right now, like I said before, I'm still pretty new in the web development, my web development journey. So I'm still learning Bootstrap right now. I'm in the process of, again, learning React, and you are able to use Bootstrap with React as well. The doc's going to be a better resource to learn about how to install that than me right now, but it's all pretty simple and pretty easy as long as you're able to follow the instructions. And I believe another presenter said before that a lot of the Bootstrap websites might look pretty similar, which is true. But if you're really just trying to get a front end up pretty quickly, it's very simple and very easy to start up with, to learn, and you're able to go from there. So that was going to be just an introduction overview of how to get started with Bootstrap at the very least. Again, the docs are going to be your best friend here, but I'm sure people have heard of W3 Schools has a pretty good primer on Bootstrap, as well as just looking at some other CodePen examples in order to get a good understanding and to learn Bootstrap as well is going to be another good resource there. But that was going to be what I have for Bootstrap.
Awesome, thank you. Are there any questions?
I think I want to share my kind of my experience with the Bootstrap.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like banks, are like more enterprise clients. They prefer like IBM products or like a Bootstrap because IBM products, right? They believe it's like you're buying something, so you can rest assured. End of the day, they'll help you to what are the problems come with those products. So I think Bootstrap is more preferred in the banking, like in my experience, because one, it's a brand value, right? So Bootstrap is like, I don't know, it's like a Coke. Everyone likes Coke. I don't know why we like, but we like. So I think it's more brand value, Bootstrap. Yeah, so I think, and also on the second thought, accordion, I think you mentioned accordion. Even in my recent project, if I had to do accordion using Tailwind or style component, vanilla CSS, it's a lot of tasks. So I'd rather pick it up Bootstrap accordion. I guess end of the day, the way I'm looking at it is it's just driving a car. So it doesn't matter. You still use engine is same, right? Vanilla CSS. So it's a V6 or V4 engine, same engine. So I think you can have a combination of vanilla CSS, Bootstrap, or even style components or Tailwind. I think that's my take on that.
Thanks for the input. That was a very good metaphor. Just driving a car trying to get to A to B. If you can plug and play with these components. So that's a very good metaphor.
And also, end of the day, right? As a customer, if I'm buying from Amazon products or Netflix, watching movie, I really don't care under the hood are using vanilla CSS or Tailwind or style components. I don't give a hoot, right? All I care is like when you see Netflix versus I don't know whether you have access to those, but Amazon Prime Video or like some other YouTube, right? I enjoy some of the. I think best my favorite is Airbnb. That's what more of I believe CSS. I think they shine in the terms of US UX or US CSS. My favorite Airbnb compared to like not so great CSS websites, right? So yeah, thanks.
Thank you. So I'll have my Twitter up on the screen if you want to follow me there. Do some retweeting and tweeting here and there. So there it is.
Awesome, thank you. So I think we have Joe next. Joe, let us know when you're ready. Might need to stop sharing, Brandon, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Let me go ahead. Share. You guys should see my screen?
Yep.
Excellent. Okay. Excellent. You see the presentation now?
Yeah. Yep.
Cool. Sorry, this is the first time I've used Teams, so I just installed it this morning, so I wasn't sure if I got it all working. Okay. So today I'm going to be teaching you guys about why I think you should be using the Foundation framework. Okay. And so who am I? I'm Joe Workman. Just a little bit about myself. Been married 22 years, father of 3. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area. Also lived in London and in Brazil for a little bit. I've been doing software development for 22 years. And I founded a company called Weaver Space back in 2010, where I actually make software for developers. Okay. So let's give you a little bit of history about Foundation. Foundation was created by Zerb, a company called Zerb. They were a web design shop in San Jose, California. And version 2 was released back in 2011. And kind of what its claim to fame was, it was actually the first major framework to do mobile first development. And it also used Sass. You know, the big two back in that time was Bootstrap versus Foundation. That's been like the battle over the past 10 years, right? Which one are you going to use? Obviously, Bootstrap had a leg up. It was done by Twitter, but Foundation really gained a lot of traction with mobile first and Sass, because at the time Bootstrap was using less, and well, Sass won out, right? Basically, less is still around, but Sass is pretty much the winner. And mobile first was obviously a great design philosophy. And you know what? Bootstrap uses both of those now. So Foundation blazed the trails. So what's going on with Foundation today? Like what's going on, 12 years later? So I actually am the core maintainer. I took over the Foundation project back in 2020. I had a long-standing relationship with the guys at Zerb, and they were downsizing and wanted to make sure the project lived on. So I took over the project as the core maintainer back in 2020. There's been over 1,000 contributors to Foundation over the years. So it's just got a huge contributor base. Even today, it still gets 100 downloads per month, 100 million downloads per month. And the current version is version 6.7.4. And there's the website. If you want to go check it out, it's get.foundation. And yeah, we have a great documentation site. And we're working towards version 7 in the future, which we'll get to that a little bit later. So how is Foundation different than Tailwind? It is very similar to Bootstrap in that it is a component-based framework. Okay, and Brandon did a great job. He kind of showed you kind of what that means. It basically means you have all kinds of, grids, buttons, cards, accordions, menus, sliders, tabs. I'm not going to go in and show you all of that. It's just everything you could want. Pre-baked, all you need to do is copy the code, paste it in, and you can modify it and tweak it with various parameters and classes and all kinds of stuff, okay? But essentially, you have just a ton of pre-made components that you can just simply copy and paste into your projects, right? So here's just a very simple example of a card, right? It is very nice in that it's a very nice semantically, styled language, or, where you have, class of card and you can have your sections. Very nice looking HTML. Conversely, if you do something the same exact thing in Tailwind, right? Yeah, it's not so pretty, not so easy to use. So now I know that's throwing some punches out there right now. I'm not personally a huge fan of Tailwind. Let me just go back to that, where pretty much all your code is in your HTML, and there's places for it. I think maybe if you're using some sort of JavaScript framework that is, component based, like maybe Vue or React, and a lot of these snippets, you're making your own things inside your various components. And in those frameworks, a lot of times it's easier to have everything in the HTML rather than trying to maintain HTML and CSS files. So that's kind of where Tailwind got its starting point, right? Was in these frameworks where you could just have a component and all of that component was inside of an HTML file, right? And it just made it nice and clean. And I actually know Adam, had beers with him at conferences, the creator of Tailwind, and I'm glad that it's successful. But it's just not for me. Creating websites like that, I'd prefer to have just a nicer, prettier looking thing, have separation of my styles and my HTML. I don't know, it just seems cleaner to me. So yeah, that's the big difference there. So with all that said, kind of banging on utility classes a little bit, Foundation does have a lot of utility classes as well. Okay, but I feel they're where they should be. They're a little limiting in that, it gives us things such as, rounding of corners really quick, or shadows, or, adding some margins and paddings, standardized, a standard layout and spacing grid. Okay. Flexbox utility classes for quickly aligning content, vertically or horizontally, or setting the flex direction and things of that nature, right? And obviously visibility, showing something on mobile versus hiding something on desktop, something of that nature, right? So, there are a lot of utility classes baked into Foundation, and but they don't go quite as far as Tailwind does, right? So, utility classes do have their space, and I do agree with that. Next up is mixing and matching, and what I mean by this is essentially, I think Foundation is a lot of people look at the components and they're very generic, okay? And they're meant to be used with each other, right? So, if you want a lightbox menu, you can, pair the modal with a particular one of the accordion menus. And maybe that is, you're building that sort of menu. So the Foundation components are really meant to be mixed and matched with each other. They're supposed to be extremely generic, very, easy to configure as well. So you can use them together to build what you want, okay? Think of them as kind of like Legos, essentially. And one bit about frameworks that haven't been touched upon really at all today is accessibility. So Foundation goes and helps you a lot with accessibility. So in that terms of the JavaScript that it loads to ensure that the proper events and the proper, things are, generated for screen readers. Whereas if you're using a component like Tailwind, Tailwind is purely style-based. You're not going to get any of the accessibility goodness. And accessibility really is a hot point right now, especially in the world. There's a lot of companies getting sued because their websites are not accessible. So you really need to think about that when you're designing a website. You want to make sure that forms, keyboard navigation, outlines around buttons, all that is set up so it's properly set up for accessibility. Okay. Now, what kind of really sets Foundation apart from any other framework, right? So we talked about how Foundation really is kind of a set of components, very similar to how Bootstrap has that. However, Foundation has some things that I don't think any other framework really does. And that's a build your own framework, BYOF. What does that mean? Well, you don't have to use Foundation's code snippets, okay? There is, if you're not familiar, there's something called Sass mixins, and Foundation, all of the Foundation snippets that you use and all the styles that are generated are all done via our Sass mixin APIs. So if you wanted to create your own button or you wanted to create your own custom grid, you can do that with the Sass mixins. So, a lot of very large successful websites out there like Disney and other sites, they're actually using Foundation, but if you looked at the code, you would have no clue because they're not using any of the snippets that you would find online. They're using our mixins to create their own grids. They're using our mixins to create their own buttons, right? So it really is using this as a framework to build your own framework, okay? And that's why, a lot of people talked about it today, is, you never hear that looks like Foundation. You've heard it many times today that that site looks like a Bootstrap site, right? Foundation is less opinionated. And on top of that, it has more configurations, and those Sass mixin APIs really allow you to kind of make it your own so that, you know, you can really have something unique. Now, you should definitely learn CSS. That was talked about a lot today. 100% agree with that, right? Use the Foundation as a starting point and build upon that. Use it as a foundation, right? That's exactly what it's meant to be. So next up is what's the future of Foundation? So I am working on Foundation 7 and 8 actually right now. What does that curtail? Okay. So right now, Foundation does still use jQuery. Okay. You can use jQuery 3, jQuery 2, both work. Obviously, jQuery 3 is better, a little smaller, less obtrusive. But anyway, so we are moving everything over to Vanilla.js for Foundation 7. I already have most of the CSS variable stuff all baked in. And then version 8, we're going to go towards web components and really componentizing each individual thing, okay? Using the official web components from, you know, JavaScript. And if you want to help, please go ahead and connect with me if you want to help and, you know, help make any of this happen. That would be awesome. And yeah, actually, before we go to the thank you, you know, everyone else kind of did a little bit demos. I wasn't really planning on it, but I figured, you know, I just kind of give you a tour of the doc portal. So Foundation does have an extremely extensive site where, just like, you know, all the others, you can just copy and paste snippets. So it's a really great site. So check out the, you know, the doc site for Foundation. Again, it's at get.foundation. You go to docs and site docs. There's more than just Foundation. There's also an entire email framework that we have with Foundation as well, which are used by millions as well to design their corporate and, you know, emails that go out to their audiences. Okay. And then next up, I was just going to show you kind of the configurations. So Foundation is very componentized. So here's a particular, you know, JavaScript build file. Just kind of shows you how you can import each individual component. If you want all of them, this does that. You can also, you know, import individual components. So like a gentleman earlier said, hey, you know what? I want to use the accordion and maybe the, you know, equalizer or the drop down from Foundation. And then I want to do other, you know, I want to use Tailwind for something else. Well, that's very easy here. You could just go ahead into this file and, you know, import the exact components that you want into your build and you're done, right? Same thing for Sass. If we go into Sass, there's, you know, a centralized configuration file that you can configurize all the colors, the sizing, everything to the exact, you know, minute. You can really make it your own, okay? So this is the first level of configuration. Then you can you know, go on top of, and then also here in the file, you can import individual components just like we did with the JavaScript, right? So if you want to, you know, if you want to import various components, you can just import them into your build with Sass. So it's super easy. If you just want to use a handful of components, or if you want to use the entire framework, you can easily do that. Okay. Let me go back to my presentation. So yeah, there we go. Again, I'm Joe Workman. I'm Joe Workman pretty much everywhere: Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube. Yeah, a couple shameless plugs. Check out my company called Weaverspace. Again, we make kind of drag and drop web design tools for Mac users. Sorry, Windows guys out there. And I have a drag and drop foundation builder called foundationstacks.com. Again, Mac only as well for now. And another plug, an open source plugin I developed recently called Proton. It's a fun little static site builder, and it's really cool. It's essentially, you know, a lot of builders or CMS or static site generators, a lot of the latest stuff's built in JavaScript. And the problem with that is that it muddies up the dependencies, right? I'm sure you've gone into, you know, a project that, you know, imports, you know, a site builder that is built in JavaScript, and you have this dependency nightmare, right? And so yeah, check out Proton. It's not built in JavaScript. It's actually built in PHP. so that you get all that entire builder is separated externally from all of your node dependencies in your front end projects. So it just removes all of that. So you don't need to worry about, oh, I want to use, a newer version of this library, but my builder is using this old version, or my builder is using a library that's using an older version, and then trying to resolving all that is maddening, right? So I wanted to just get rid of all of that headache, and so I built Proton so that we have a really powerful, fast static site builder that works with any framework. You don't have to use the foundation framework. It will work with anything. It's purely the site generator. So check that out. It's pretty cool. Version beta 5 is out right now. I do have a couple people already building live production sites with it, so that's a lot of fun. So check out Proton. Cool. And that's it.
Awesome. I think we've got one question. So they're saying basically they use Foundation Press, and basically build their own framework with what has been described as very useful and custom. Also, I guess it's not really a question, but
yeah, Foundation Press is a WordPress theme that's been built so that you can use Foundation inside your WordPress sites. Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Awesome. And it was interesting you talked about this static site generator that doesn't have dependencies, because I'm sure, like you mentioned, like we've had it so many times where dependency, something else has been updated, which has screwed something else up.
Exactly.
It just goes into a nightmare. And then you've got all these node modules, and you don't even know what half of them do. Like, what are they doing
exactly.
there? Kind of stuff.
Yep.
So,
exactly. So I do have to admit, there's one node dependency.
Yeah.
That's if you want live reload. So I have one node dependency for live reload, but it's an optional thing. But yeah, it's a really great one. So check it out, Proton. Thank you.
Nice. Yeah, thank you. Cool. So I don't know if there's any other questions people want to just shout out. But if not, we got Luke next. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.
Luke, are you there? Yes.
Yeah, I'm here. Hello. 1 second. Get all this sorted out. All right, I'll share my screen then, huh? Let me know if you can't hear me okay, or if there's anything I missed here. I'm trying a new way of presenting here. I've got my slides in Google Slides like normal, but I've got my notes in Figma, so we'll see how this goes. Start from the beginning, I guess. Everyone can see the screen okay?
Yeah.
Perfect. Cool. So hi everyone, and thanks for coming, and thanks for having me, Ilesh, as well. Today I'm going to talk about a project called Twinned. This is not a technical talk particularly, nor is it a sell on the project itself, but I'd say it's more of a story of where the idea came from, how we built it, and where it is now, which is hopefully going to be sort of inspirational more than educational. So a bit of context, I'm Luke Jackson with 2 N's almost everywhere. 1 N was taken almost everywhere. And I'd consider myself a product engineer. My bachelor's was in computer science and my master's was in design. So I sit in that weird and apparently still undesirable midpoint of not being the best at either, but fortunately being just about good enough to be at both to be dangerous, I'd say. If you ask anybody, they would say I'm a minimalist, and I guess that's where this story starts. As you can see on the left there, that was my Harry Potter room that I lived in when I lived in Boston, Massachusetts in America for a year. And that's literally all I took with me except for this bag of clothes. And I'm quite into open source development, as you can see on the right there. I've been at it for quite a while now. So back in, I don't know, it's going to be 7 or 8 years ago.
I was working on white label online casinos, like this beautiful interface we see here. You know, like I say, this was 8 or 9 years ago, and most sites tended to look like this. What we were essentially doing here is, you know, building a UI on top of a random number generator. It was a bit of a sell your soul kind of thing, but this was my first developer job at the time. There were a lot of really good artists at the game studio, and that was part of the thing. And so I kind of stepped back from design, even though I just finished it, a degree in that. And I sort of started obsessing over layout and CSS and HTML, responsiveness and squidginess and things like that. I realized that realistically there were very few variations required to achieve like a typical but modern at the time white label website like this, things like grids and hero banners and inputs and stuff like that. And so this led me to making a very small library which I called Prototype at the time. So okay, well there you go. There's actually a hint at how long ago. 7 years ago was the last initial commit there, so not quite 8, but still a very long time ago, at least it feels like. And what I was doing there is essentially abbreviating a load of rules that I found myself writing every single day. And so when I say library, I really just mean a CSS file that had these square brackets, notation, things like AIC for align item center and things like that. Things that I had to write 14 times a day, 40 times a day, 400 times a day. And I guess I took this into work and thought this is going to be the best thing since sliced bread. I'll never have to write another line of CSS in my lifetime. And I like CSS, so but it'd just be so much less to think about if I can just write these shorthands. But as soon as I got into work, I think everyone just thought I was crazy. And frankly, in retrospect, I'd definitely taken it like too far. This AIC, well, that made sense to me at the time, align item center, but to everyone else, it was just 3 letters randomly thrown together. So I forgot about the idea really at that point in time, and we started using like a house-built Sass less kind of setup and some untyped theming and even Bootstrap, I think, for some of these sites, which has already been talked about today. And the dev world, I would say, went on like this for a while and still is, quite happily. But projects like Tachyons came along. And this seemed to have like sensibly and still quite comprehensively come up with some good naming conventions, not like mine, and convinced at least a semi-critical mass of people to start learning the new language. And I think this is important to note, like this is what we mean when we talk about these utility CSS systems, or any CSS system really, or programming language. It is a language, right? It's a collection of phrases and words that have some associated meaning. And personally, I think this is actually what Tailwind did best. They almost certainly coined and popularized a very intuitive and effective meta language or vocabulary on top of CSS. And as Ilesh said earlier, like they also documented all these shorthands exceptionally with examples and descriptions and things like that that made it easy to learn, or nice to learn. And furthermore, it wasn't that much harder than CSS. Some would say it's easier, and I would say it's at least a bit more expressive. So Tailwind was gaining popularity thanks to the very well-written and renowned ebook Refactoring UI. I would say for those here today who are first getting into CSS and layouts and things like that, this is an excellent read by Adam and Steve here. But I would say there was a sort of brewing problem. And although there are a finite number of layouts, you know, in modern web or even old web, we still have these holy grail kind of layouts. There's still a lot of combinations, and as soon as you start to give people some primitive options, they're going to start asking for more options. They want granular control over everything, or at least they think they do. And the request for customization came in, and those options were added. Some definitely made sense, you know, border thicknesses, I want more than one, will for do, things like responsive and pseudo variants, color schemes, sizing scales, all of this stuff adds up. And although the number of tokens, I would say, seemed to be increasing steadily, there was a combination explosion happening under the hood. I remember, I think at one point, I was on the next project and Tailwind was there generating 18 megabytes of CSS, which I think was all possible permutations. But even here we can see the at version 2.2, Tailwind, excuse me, minimum CSS was weighing in at 2.9 megabytes uncompressed here, which is certainly not practical, to say the least. So I was in Greece on holiday around this time, and when I realized this, and it sort of got me thinking, why are we generating all these rules ahead of time? This is every single possible permutation for every single website ever. 2.9 megabytes is a lot of CSS. What if, when a DOM element got added to the page, the browser could somehow just know the lookup for these rules and use a magic dictionary function or something like that that would turn MT-16 into margin top 1 rem or whatever it is converts to. Surely if like the syntax is easy enough for humans to grok, then we could break it up and have a computer process each part and infer some meaning from it. The more I've thought about it, I mean, it turns out actually humans are really good at noticing these patterns, and I think that's been proven by the popularity of Tailwind and its vocabulary. Like, it's very good. It's obviously good enough to have people want to learn it, but computers just don't get it, unfortunately. You can't just know that MT16 works. So it was at this point where I definitely regretted not taking the computer languages module at university, but I brute forced my way through what was essentially a big nested switch statement that split up a rule or a directive, I think I called them at the time, and then went through each part and said, okay, if I match this, then do this, and then continue to here and do that. And I did this on the plane on the way home, and by the time I'd landed, we had 1,000 lines of code that would convert BG red 500 to background FF something, whatever that was in the theme file. And that became what I called at the time Ocean Wind. Like I say, 1,000 lines of code-ish, 10 kilobytes compressed, and maybe 90% compliant with Tailwind at the time. Whatever version it was, probably 2. And some of the grammars were quite unpredictable, actually. When you got into it, it seemed to make sense for humans, but it was quite verbose when it came to actually all the permutations and teaching a computer how to do that. However, it became, reasonably popular, and 260 odd stars there, and especially popular, I would say, amongst CSS and JS nerds who were interested in both this Tailwind, but also doing things at runtime and injecting their styles there. And this is where I met Sasha Tundle. He messaged me one day and was like, hey, I think I've rewritten Ocean Wind, but I think it's way better. And do I mind if we publish the module? And I said, no, of course not. Like, that's what open source is about, right? We stand on the shoulders of giants, and not that I'm calling myself a giant, but at least that's how I feel like when I'm using open source. And I checked it out, and he'd done it exceptionally well. He'd essentially taken the essence of Tailwind, but done it properly, turned it into a full-blown interpreter compiler with types, tests, IntelliSense, benchmarks, everything. You know, the real developer stuff, not just a hack together switch statement done on a plane after a beer. And it was awesome. It did loads. It did more than Ocean Wind did, and definitely more than Tailwind at the time. But after we got talking, we kind of agreed that maybe it did too much. So we banged our heads together and sat for a while, had many deep chats about what we would like to see and where we'd like to go with this. And we decided we'd make some kind of middle ground. It turns out there's a lot of really cool things you can do if you ship the compiler to the browser. So all of this, you know, just like the switch statement, as you can imagine, everything that Sasha had made would run in the browser right there. And it unlocks all kinds of superpowers, like even Adam, I think, had hinted at this when he saw Ocean Wind. So we knew we were onto something. And that something became Twin, as we know it today. So this was a combined organization, mostly developed by Sasha himself and then bolstered by the community at large. One of the most important benefits, I'd say, of the Tailwind in this instance is that you no longer have to worry about this combinatory explosion, right? If you ship the compiler, it has all the definitions of all the tokens and all the combinations assumed by some grammar, like, you know, what are valid combinations of tokens. Then you get a lot of bang for your buck, you know. Sasha worked, you know, insanely hard on minimizing the size of this, and I think this is a 100% Tailwind v2 compliant compiler interpreter that can run in the browser, and it's under 14 kilobytes. It's approximately 13 point something, which is quite phenomenal, really. So this means that as you added more styles, well, it wouldn't change the size. It would still be 14 kilobytes. You could add as many as you want, any kind of permutations, anything. And 14 kilobytes, I think, to some people might sound a lot potentially to ship to the client. But we've got to remember at this point, the Tailwind CDN build was still megabytes big. You know, we could guarantee 14 kilobytes was the most you'd ever have to ship. Furthermore, Twin required no build step, which made it very useful for environments where you can't rely on SAS pre-processing, which I think potentially, well, I think Tailwind did at the time, or SCSS, and maybe still does now to this day. You know, places like CodePen or environments like Dino, runtimes like Dino, or AWS Lambdas for server-side rendering, these kind of things, like where you can't just install Tailwind as a big preprocessor. We thought these two things, you know, the standaloneness was a good enough value proposition that adds to the current Tailwind offering. And it had gained, you know, quite a bit of popularity on its launch. So we reached out to Adam to ask if he wanted to make this an official Tailwind offering. And it turned out there was a library with a similar value proposition called Windy who had figured out this compiler mode, but in Node, not in the browser. And they'd also talked to Adam. So probably coincidental, but about a month later, Tailwind announced their new JIT compiler, which improved performance and enabled them to expand this token vocabulary and grammars without having to worry about combinatory explosions. Tailwind would, you know, the claim was Tailwind would only generate the styles you needed based on the static analysis of your project files on disk, which was quite the evolution at the time. Before you just got everything, like I said. Unfortunately, this kind of made Windy redundant at the time, and I think anyone following Twitter at that point in time would probably remember there's quite a bit of drama there, but I'm thinking that's all water under the bridge now, and we should probably ignore it. Luckily, though, I guess for us, Twin still had an edge over Tailwind at this point. It still didn't require the build step. It was super fast, and there was only 14 kilobytes. Since we released Twin, we have definitely seen other runtime Tailwind compilers spring into existence. But from what we've seen so far, they're quite heavyweight. And so although they help alleviate some pains, like running in environments where you can't use a build step, I wouldn't say they're fit for production use. I think Tailwind now have, either they have or they plan to replace the old CDN build with this CDN script, which is a JavaScript run compiler, like just like Twin. Which is awesome, and it does allow people to get started in one line of script tag like this, which is great. I guess the only downside here is it weighs around 95 or 100 kilobytes, I think. So although it's good for the hobby stuff, it's not really fit for production. So for these reasons, we didn't shut down the project, and people kept using Twin. We started seeing quite a few production applications of Twin in the wild, and we still do to this day. This is just a very small selection of them, but it is out there. I guess notable projects here include Cloudflare pages, some Tailwind page builders by some of our early supporters, and some blogs and some e-commerce templates out there, which are very attractive, actually. We even got some sponsors, which this is the first open source project I've ever asked for sponsors, but we thought it was appropriate given the amount of time we'd sunk into the project at this time. And I'll just say now publicly how very grateful we are for these people. Ryan Christian, very prolific Preact developer. We have SAS Design here, who are longtime sponsors of the project, and I think they make use of Twin in their templates here. And then even Jordan Walk, the creator of React, started sponsoring us because he was using it in a personal project way back when, in nearly a year ago now. But yeah, thank you everyone and the community at large for sponsoring us on this. As well as having the benefits we already talked about, the compiler was portable and fast enough to do like critical CSS extraction at serve time. So it would read your files as they were being requested, extract out all the definitions that it needs, or the tokens, and then turn them into CSS and inject them into the head. We could, I guess, once we figured this was possible, we started making some plugins, so like Next and Remix. These are supported as sort of extensions of Twin, so you can just drop into that project and get going. Once you do this, and those static things are injected, then it ships that static page plus Twin, the compiler, to the client, and then the client can, or the compiler itself will sort of kick into action after initial render and start taking over and compiling any new rules from like client-side rendered pages or components just on the fly, quite seamlessly, really. I guess I was working on a project for a client at the time. We actually built this nearly from scratch with some colleagues, and we were in the fortunate position to actually try Twin out here. And to this day, Twin is now used on US and Canada, seem to be India and Japan, the UK, Puma.com websites, as the sole provider of CSS, I guess, or sole implementation. And we have had no complaints, really, just generally using Tailwind syntax, or Twin either. I'm still a lead developer there, and I can safely say my job has been made much easier and simpler by the fact I've never had to review a CSS file. And I genuinely love CSS, but it's so nice not to think about. So where does that leave us today? Well, Sasha is hard at work again, now building version 1 with the help of the community at large, I would say. This will be fully Tailwind v3 compliant, but also built specifically to support more than just the Tailwind token and grammar set. We want to make it so that everyone could define their own design system language, essentially, and use the Twin compiler to generate and append their styles to HTML at build, serve, or runtime, ideally. The fact all are possible, we encourage you to do it wherever it makes sense for your project. And yeah, we're still quite ahead of the curve with regards some of these syntaxes. So here you can see this grouping, which would technically reduce a lot of your class names. So people who don't like the really long class names can start to essentially abstract out commonalities and put these brackets, a little bit like maths class. And this would result in like focus outline none, focus ring to, focus ring offset, blah, blah, blah. So we're not actually looking to add any more features yet, I don't think particularly, but we do want to encourage this bring your own framework compiler twist onto it, very much leaning into that. So obviously this was stolen from the last talk by Joe, but we've just added the C on the end. You know, this is a framework compiler. You bring it yourself. So I think.
That's funny.
Thanks, Jeff. I added that slide just as I saw yours because it was also great. And you know, that's what this would look like, right? You can actually define your own thing. So here we have scroll snap, and then we have a function that would generate the rule for things like scroll snap X. You can see parts is just like the different parts here, starting at the end and working backwards. So this would say scroll snap type, and then it would take the X character from the rule, and it would just bang it on the end there, and it would do all that at runtime. So essentially these things become functions. These rules are just functions that take some arguments, including theme and stuff like that. Furthermore, for those who don't really like this utility approach, you could go whole hog and just call something a plugin button, which applies all these styles. And then you could just call, you know, class name or TW is button, and it would end up rendering all of that, or button indigo. So they've extended the normal button, but with background indigo and text white. So this kind of, you know, anyone can do this. Just because Tailwind did it, they have done it exceptionally well, and you have to convince people to learn your grammars and your vocabulary. But if you can do it, why not? The compiler will support you. So thank you very much. I feel like I went on much longer than I should have there, but hopefully you enjoyed it. Again, I'm at Luke Jackson everywhere. And if you like this talk, then another shameless plug related again to what Joe said. It's called Don't Build That App. No Babel, no Webpack, no worries. And it sort of focuses on dependency-free development and the journey I went through in that regard too. That's it, yeah. If you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. I think I've just put a comment on there that if you can share the link for the BBC post.
Yes, I can
that'd be
indeed.
nice.
Yep. Sorry, second monitor's just it's just gone black, so the screen is on there. Oh, it's coming back, I think now, hopefully, so then I can okay, cool. Yeah, I'll share this in the chat.
Awesome.
And I will try find the window. I guess you're in here. Yeah, cool.
So yeah, it's interesting your journey also, like trying to get this into or with Tailwind, but it's still sort of not going for it. And it's great to see the progress outside of it, because it looks like, you know, ways that we can kind of improve what we're doing, especially if people are using Tailwind websites. So this is great.
yeah, it just offers a different approach, you know. It's more of that CSS and JS flavor, which tends to be, you know, like Marmite. Either people love it or they hate it. But
Yeah, that's great. Are there any questions for Luke? If not, what we can do is we can pretty much end it there. But just I'm going to send a link of the swag doc again in the chat if you guys want to do that in your own time. But I just want to really thank everyone for joining, all the speakers. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your talks. And I will probably at some point get the recording and then share that with you all. And what we might do is I'll speak to the people that spoke, see if we can share their slide deck as well, if possible. We can add that into the description of the talks as well. But yeah, thank you, everyone. And hope you have a nice evening, day, depending where you are.
thanks, Ilesh.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ilesh. Bye. Have
Bye.
a good day.